Children. The Outer Banks of North Carolina do not forgive mistakes. The Atlantic makes sure of that. Children. Nora Callahan had made exactly one mistake in her 24 years, and the storm had followed her ever since. Not the kind that comes off the water with thunder and salt spray, but the quieter, meaner kind that settles into a person's chest and refuses to leave. She had been running from it for 11 months when the real storm finally caught her. Children. She had not intended to stop at Hatteras Island. She had not intended anything beyond putting miles between herself and Beaufort, South Carolina, where the Decker family had money, connections, and a very particular interest in making sure Nora never spoke to anyone who mattered again. Children. The old pickup she was driving, borrowed, not stolen, she told herself, though the distinction had blurred considerably, chose the decision for her when the front left tire blew out on Highway 12 with the sky turning the color of a bad bruise and the wind off Pamlico Sound already strong enough to lean into. Children. She was on the side of the road, kneeling in wet sand with a lug wrench she did not entirely know how to use, when the headlights of a truck pulled up behind her. Children. She heard the door open, heavy boots on asphalt. Children. You need help with that? Children. The voice was low, not loud, not aggressive, just the plain, practical voice of someone accustomed to speaking only when something needed to be said. Children. Nora looked up. Children. He was tall, somewhere north of 6'2", with the kind of build that comes not from a gym, but from hauling crab traps and repairing boat engines since adolescence. Dark hair. Children. Wet from the rain that had just started, pushed back from a face that was all hard angles and careful stillness. Children. His jacket was the heavy canvas kind that fishermen wear when they stop caring about looking like anything other than a fisherman. Children. I can manage, Nora said automatically. Children. He looked at the lug wrench in her hand, at the flat tire, at the sky. Children. Storm's going to be bad, he said. Not a threat, just a fact. Category 1. Made landfall at Ocracoke about 2 hours ago. Children. Nora had not known that. She had not had her radio on because she had not wanted to hear news from any direction. Children. I'll be fine, she said, which was the most thoroughly false sentence she had spoken all week, and she had been speaking quite a few. Children. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crouched down beside her in the sand, took the lug wrench from her hand with a patience that somehow managed not to be condescending, and broke the first lug nut loose with a single turn. Children. His name, she would learn later, was Silas Vane. He had lived on Hatteras Island for 31 years, the last 6 of them alone, in a gray shingled house on the Sound side that had belonged to his grandfather and his grandfather's father before that. Children. He ran a small charter fishing operation out of the marina at Frisco, took tourists out for red drum and flounder, and otherwise kept to himself with the practiced ease of someone who had decided that was the correct way to live and stopped re-examining the decision. Children. He changed her tire in 11 minutes. By the time he finished, the rain was coming sideways. Children. Where are you going? He asked, standing and wiping his hands on the back of his jeans. Children. Nora had no answer for that. She had not had an answer for that in 11 months. Children. I don't know yet, she said, and for the first time in a very long time, the truth felt easier than anything else. Children. He looked at her for a moment, not the way men sometimes looked at her, assessing and wanting, but the way a person looks at a problem they are genuinely trying to solve. Children. Highway 12's already flooding north of here, he said. You won't make it to the bridge. I've got a spare room. He paused. It locks from the inside. Children. She almost said no. The survival instinct that had kept her alive and moving for 11 months was screaming that she did not know this man, that she did not know anything about the people on this island, that the Decker family had reach and money, and that reach and money had a way of preceding her into towns she thought she had disappeared into. Children. But the sky chose that moment to open completely, and the rain that came down was not rain anymore, but a solid, roaring wall of Atlantic Ocean, determined to reclaim the highway. Children. She grabbed her bag from the truck. Children. His house smelled like salt and machine oil, and something faintly like the cedar chests her grandmother used to keep. A wood stove sat in the corner of the main room, already lit. Children. Throwing orange light across walls hung with hand-drawn nautical charts and a single-mounted photograph of a boat on calm water. It was not a warm house in the decorative sense. There were no throw pillows. Children. No rugs with patterns, no evidence that anyone had tried to make it look like anything, but it was solid. Children. Every joint and beam of it felt like it was not going anywhere. Children. He made coffee without asking if she wanted any, and set it on the table in front of her. Children. She was still wearing her jacket, still wet, still coiled tight with every instinct pointed toward the door, when she noticed that her hands were shaking. She had been shaking for some time, she realized. She had just been too focused on moving to notice. Children. You can use the bathroom to get dry, Silas said, not looking at her, turning back toward the stove. Towels are in the cabinet under the sink. Children. I'm fine, Nora said. Children. He turned around at that, looked at her directly for the first time since they had come inside. Children. You've said that twice now, he said, and neither time I've believed it. Children. She did not have a response to that. Children. She took the towel. Children. The storm was fully on them by midnight. The house shook in gusts that came off Pamlico Sound with the concentrated fury of open water, and the rain against the windows was a continuous roar that made the inside feel very small and very far from anything else. Nora lay in the spare room on a narrow bed with a wool blanket over her and listened to the house breathe through the storm, and she did not sleep. Children. At some point, she did not know what time, she heard Silas moving in the kitchen, the sound of the wood stove being fed, the low, specific clank of cast iron. Children. She lay still. Children. She had not meant to stay. She had not meant for any of this. She had a bag with 3 changes of clothes, $68 in cash, a burner phone with no contacts, and a piece of paper folded into the innermost pocket of her jacket that she had been carrying for 11 months without showing to a single person. Children. The paper was the reason she was running. Children. And the paper was the reason that if anyone caught up to her, she would not simply be sent home. Children. By the time the storm eased at dawn, dropping from a roar to a sullen gray mutter, Nora had decided to leave. She rose, dressed, pulled her jacket on, and reached for her bag. Children. The paper crinkled in the interior pocket when she moved. Children. She paused. Children. She stood in the middle of the spare room, with the thin light coming gray and wet through the window. And she thought about the Decker family, and she thought about what was written on that paper, and she thought about what happened to the last person who had tried to do what she was trying to do. Children. Her name had been Sandra Moat. She had been a paralegal at Hartwell and Greer in Beaufort for 9 years. She had kept meticulous notes. She had planned carefully. And 11 months ago her car had gone into the Broad River at a bend with no guardrail and no witnesses, and the sheriff's report had said the word accident so firmly and so finally that it seemed to have been written before the car even hit the water. Children. Nora had been the one to find Sandra's notes. She had been the one to understand what they meant. Children. She had been the one to take the evidence and run. Children. She picked up her bag and went to the kitchen. Children. Silas was at the table with a mug of coffee and a marine weather report spread out in front of him, reading it with the concentrated attention of someone for whom weather reports were not casual information, but operational necessity. He looked up when she came in. Children. He looked at her bag. Children. He looked at her face. Children. Stay, he said. Not a question, not a demand. Something in between, the simple statement of a man who did not say things he did not mean. Roads still flooded. You won't get to the bridge until afternoon at the earliest. Children. It was true. She could see through the kitchen window, the standing water still sheeting across the road, the Sound brimming at its banks. Children. All right, she said, until the road clears. Children. She did not know it then, but the road clearing would not be the thing that made her leave, and it would not be the thing that made her stay. Children. She stayed 3 days. Children. Not because the flooding lingered, it mostly receded by the second afternoon, but because she had pulled out the burner phone on the second morning to check the single email address she monitored from a library account in a name that was not hers, and what she found there had stopped her cold. Children. Someone was ahead of her. Children. The message was from a man she knew only as a screen name, a former Decker employee who had reached out to Sandra Moat before Sandra died and then gone very quiet for 10 months. It said, in 8 words that she read 4 times to be sure she was reading them correctly. They know about the federal contact. Get out now. Children. Which meant someone had intercepted her communication with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Raleigh, which meant the Decker family's reach extended further than she had believed. Children. Which meant that the evidence she was carrying, 16 pages of Sandra's meticulous, damning notes documenting 17 years of systematic land fraud, forged environmental permits and 3 bribery payments to a sitting county commissioner, was the only copy in existence of something that very powerful people very much wanted to not exist. Children. Nora sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the spare room and breathed carefully for a long time. Children. Then she went to find Silas. Children. He was out back in the boat shed, doing something methodical and grease-involved to an outboard motor. He did not hear her coming over the sound of the wind. Children. She stood in the doorway of the shed for a moment watching him work, the focused, unhurried competence of a man entirely at home in what he was doing, and she thought, you shouldn't involve him, children. You have no right to involve him. Whatever is coming is yours to carry. Children. Silas, she said. Children. He looked up. Children. I need to tell you something, she said, and after I tell you, you can ask me to leave. I'll understand. Children. He set down the wrench, wiped his hands, turned to face her with the same patient, direct attention he had given her from the first moment on the side of the road. Children, she told him. Children. Not everything, not Sandra, not the river, not the worst of what she knew. But enough. She told him about the Decker family, about the evidence, about the U.S. attorney and the intercepted communication, about the fact that someone, probably more than one someone, was currently trying to determine where she was. Children. She told him about the paper in her jacket pocket, which was not a letter and not a photograph, but a 16-page document that she had memorized in its entirety and which she intended to deliver personally to the federal courthouse in Raleigh if she could get there without being intercepted first. Children. Silas listened without interrupting. Children. When she was done, the shed was very quiet except for the sound of gulls working the sound in the distance and the soft, irregular knock of a boat against a dock somewhere outside. Children. The Decker family, he said slowly. Mitchell Decker. Children. Something shifted in his expression, not fear, but a kind of recognition, the way a person's face changes when a story they half knew suddenly comes into focus. Children. You know who they are, Nora said. Children. My father knew who they were, Silas said. His voice had gone very level. He ran a charter company out of Beaufort for 12 years. Mitchell Decker's family owned the dock lease. Children. When my father wouldn't agree to let them use his boats for, he paused, chose his words. Other purposes, they had the lease pulled. He lost the business. He was 61 years old. He looked at Nora. Children. He died 14 months later. Heart attack. Doctors said stress. Children. The shed was quiet again. Children. I'm sorry, Nora said, which was not adequate, and they both knew it. Children. So am I, Silas said. Children. He picked up the wrench, set it back down, looked at the outboard motor for a moment, as if it might tell him something useful. Children. How far is Raleigh, he said. Children. 4 hours, Nora said, in a normal situation. Children. And in this situation? Children. There's a man named Dre Cobb, Nora said. He's worked for the Decker family for 15 years. He's the one who, she stopped, started again. He was the last person Sandra Moat spoke to before her car went into the river. Children. Silas looked at her. Children. He's been 2 steps behind me since I left Beaufort, Nora said. At least, I don't know if he's closer now. Children. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Children. I have a cousin in New Bern, he said finally. She works for a state senator. She's had her own run-ins with the Decker operation. Different angle, same family. If you can get to New Bern, she can get you to Raleigh with people around you who know what they're doing. Children. Nora stared at him. Children. You don't have to do this, she said. Children. No, he agreed. He picked up the wrench again and began tightening a bolt on the motor with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided what they were doing and was getting on with it. But my father lost his livelihood to those people, and a woman lost her life, and you've been carrying 16 pages of evidence alone for almost a year. He tightened the bolt, moved to the next one. So I'm going to help you. Children. They left before dawn the next morning. Children. Silas drove. His truck was older than Nora's borrowed one, but in considerably better condition, and less likely to draw attention for the expired registration that she had only recently noticed on hers. Children. Nora sat in the passenger seat with her jacket on, and her bag between her feet and the folded paper in her interior pocket, and tried not to think about Dre Cobb or the way Sandra Moat's car had looked in the news photograph. Children. Silver and crumpled at the river's edge. Children. They made it as far as Washington, North Carolina, roughly 40 miles, before the truck that had been following them since they crossed the Mark Base Night Bridge made its move. Children. It came up fast on the 2-lane highway, a dark F-250 with no front plate, and when Silas said, "Hold on," in a voice that was very calm and very serious, Nora had just enough time to brace against the door before the truck sideswiped them. A grinding shriek of metal on metal that sent Silas's truck onto the gravel shoulder. Children. He kept it out of the ditch. Children. Barely. Children. The F-250 had pulled ahead and was slowing, blocking the road. Children. Jacket, Silas said quickly, not looking away from the truck ahead of them. The document, is it on you? Children. Yes, Nora said. Children. Keep it on you. Children. A man got out of the F-250. He was not large, compact, and precise in the way of someone who had learned that efficiency mattered more than size. He had the unhurried walk of a person who believed the situation was already resolved. He wore a heavy coat, and he put his hand in the pocket of it as he came toward them. Children. Dre Cobb. Children. Nora knew his face from an 11-month-old photograph she had found in Sandra's files. The photograph had been taken outside the Beaufort County Courthouse, Cobb standing behind Mitchell Decker like a very politely menacing piece of punctuation. Children. He stopped about 10 feet from the driver's side window. Children. Mrs. Callahan, he said. His voice carried easily in the cold morning air. Mr. Decker would like his property returned. Children. It's not his property, Nora said, and her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. Children. The document originated in a private communication, Cobb said, with the rehearsed patience of someone reciting terms they had said many times. The manner in which it was obtained was, Children. The manner in which Sandra Moat died was not an accident, Nora said. Children. Something moved across Cobb's face. Not guilt, something colder than that. Children. I wouldn't know anything about that, he said. Children. I have 16 pages that suggest otherwise, Nora said, and 2 hours ago I photographed every one of them and emailed them to 3 separate federal addresses from a device you don't know about. Children, this was a lie. Children, but it was a very specific, very deliberate lie, the kind that only works if the person you are telling it to cannot immediately disprove it, and that buys you exactly the window of time you need. Children. Cobb went very still. Children. In that stillness, Silas opened the truck door and stepped out. Children. He was a full head taller than Cobb, and the years of hauling line and living on the water had left him with the kind of physical presence that does not announce itself but does not need to. He stood beside the truck with his arms loose at his sides and looked at Cobb with an expression that was not aggressive and was not afraid and was, somehow because of those 2 absences, very serious indeed. Children. Road's clear behind us, Silas said. I'd take it. Children. Cobb looked at him, looked back at Nora. His hand was still in his coat pocket, and Nora did not look at his hand because she had decided not to look at his hand, and that decision was the only thing keeping her breathing at a normal rate. Children. Mr. Decker is a patient man, Cobb said finally, but patience has... Children. Tell Mr. Decker, Nora said, that if anything happens to either of us between here and Raleigh, the rest of what I know goes to the News and Observer and not the federal office, which is considerably less neat for everyone. Children. She did not know if this would work. Children. She knew it was all she had. Children. Cobb stood in the middle of the empty highway for a long moment. Behind him the Pamlico River moved slow and dark in the early light. A heron picked its way along the far bank, precise and unbothered. Children. Cobb took his hand out of his pocket. It was empty. Children. He walked back to the F-250, got in, pulled forward onto a side road and was gone. Children. Nora sat in the truck for a moment and breathed. Children. Silas got back in beside her. He looked straight ahead through the windshield. His jaw was set. His hands, when he put them on the wheel, were completely steady. Children. You bluffed, he said. Children. Yes, Nora said. Children. Did it work? Children. I don't know yet. Children. He looked at her. Something in his face that had been carefully closed for the entire drive had shifted, just slightly. Not open. Silas Vane was not a man who opened easily, and she suspected he never had been, but present in a way that was different from before. Children. The email, he said. Can you actually send it from somewhere? Children. There's a library in Washington, Nora said, 3 blocks from here. Children. He started the truck. Children. They sent the email from a library computer with a children's book display in the window and a volunteer in a cardigan resolving mysteries in the back. The document took 4 minutes to scan on the library's machine. Nora addressed it to the U.S. Children. Attorney's office in Raleigh, to the EPA regional office in Atlanta, and to a journalist at the News and Observer whose byline she had tracked for 3 years because Sandra Moat had once told her, in the before times when they were just 2 women having lunch, that this particular journalist was the real thing. Children. She hit send. Children. She sat back. Children. The volunteer in the cardigan looked over and smiled the automatic smile of someone who assumes all library patrons are having a perfectly ordinary day. Children. Nora smiled back. Children. Her hands had stopped shaking somewhere between the second scan and the third. Children. They reached New Bern by early afternoon. Silas's cousin was a compact, no-nonsense woman named Petra who opened her front door, looked at both of them, said, "I'll put coffee on," and made 3 phone calls before the coffee was done. By 4 o'clock, there was a state investigator in her living room. By 6, there were 2 children. Nora sat at Petra's kitchen table and placed the original 16 pages in front of the investigator, a quiet woman with reading glasses and a yellow legal pad, and began, for the first time in 11 months, to tell the whole story. Children. She told it clearly and in order. She did not shake. She did not cry, though at one point, talking about Sandra Moat, about the lunch they had shared, about the way Sandra had pressed the notes into her hand and said, "Keep these safe," just in case, with the particular lightness of someone who hoped it would never matter. She had to pause and look at the ceiling for a moment before she could continue. Children. Silas sat across the room in a chair by the window and did not say anything and did not leave. Children. It took until nearly 9 o'clock. Children. When it was over, the investigator closed her legal pad and said, in the flat professional tone of someone who has heard a great many things and learned to hold them carefully, "You did the right thing bringing this to us, Miss Callahan. We'll be in touch within 48 hours. Children. After they left, Petra heated up soup from a pot on the stove and set it on the table without ceremony, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for Nora in a long time. Children. They ate in the quiet of the kitchen, with the window showing the dark surface of the Trent River outside, still and unreflective under the clouded sky. Children. Your father's business, Nora said to Silas, not looking up from her bowl. The charter company. What was it called? Children. Vane & Son, he said, which was optimistic of him, given I was 12 when he painted the sign. Children. Nora was quiet for a moment. Children. The commissioner who took the bribe, she said. His name is in the document, all 17 years of it. Children. Silas looked at her. Children. What they did to your father, Nora said. It's in there, it won't undo anything, but it'll be on record. It'll be known. Children. The kitchen was very quiet. Petra had discreetly disappeared somewhere in the direction of the living room. Children. Silas put down his spoon. He looked at the window, at the dark water beyond it, for a long moment. Children. 11 months, he said quietly. You carried that alone for 11 months. Children. Sandra carried it longer, Nora said. I just carried it to where it needed to go. Children. He looked at her then, really looked at her, in the way that she had felt him not quite doing since the first night in the house on the Sound. The way of someone who has been careful for a long time about what they let themselves see clearly. Children. It needed to get there, he said. It was not a small thing to say, the way he said it. It was the thing he had decided, and the way Silas Vane decided things, they stayed decided. Children. 3 weeks later, the News and Observer ran a front-page story. The U.S. Attorney's Office opened a formal investigation. Mitchell Decker's attorney issued a statement that said nothing in the elaborate way that attorneys' statements often say nothing when everything is about to unravel. Children. Dre Cobb was arrested at the Raleigh-Durham airport with a one-way ticket to Cancun in his jacket pocket. Children. Nora read about it on her phone, sitting in a plastic chair in a federal office building in Raleigh, where she had spent most of the past 3 weeks answering questions and reviewing documents and giving statements that would eventually matter a great deal to a great many people whose names she would never know. Children. She called Silas from the steps of the building. Children. He picked up on the second ring. Children. They arrested Cobb, she said. Children. A pause. Wind in the background. The specific salt-heavy wind of the Sound side. He was outside, probably the boat shed. Children. Good, he said. Children. Another pause. Easier this time. Children. The road is clear, Nora said. Back to the island if I drove it. Children. She heard him set something down, metal on wood. Children. There's a pier that needs replanking before the season starts, he said. I could use someone to hand me boards. Children. I don't know anything about piers, she said. Children. I know, he said, but you're a quick study. Children. She looked out at the parking lot of the federal building, at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon going on all around her. People walking to cars, a woman on a phone, a kid on a bike, all of it unhurried and mundane and entirely, blessedly ordinary. Children. I'll be there by dark, she said. Children. She was. Children. I keep thinking about that moment on the highway outside Washington, North Carolina. Not the sideswipe, not the sound of metal on metal, but the 30 seconds after, when Dre Cobb walked toward the truck with his hand in his pocket, and Nora sat there, soaking wet from a storm she'd driven through alone, and decided to bluff. Children. She had nothing, $68, a burner phone, a document folded so many times the creases had gone soft, and she looked at the man who had been 2 steps behind her for 11 months, and she told him a lie so specific, so calm, so exactly the right shape that he believed it. That's not luck. That's what happens when a person has spent nearly a year thinking harder than the people trying to stop them. Children. I think about what it takes to do that. Not the bravery part. People talk about bravery like it's a feeling, like you either have it or you don't. But what Nora had wasn't a feeling. Children. It was something she'd built, slowly, out of necessity. She'd taken the worst thing she knew, that a woman had died. Children. That the people responsible had money and reach, and the patience of people who have never been held accountable for anything, and instead of letting that knowledge crush her, she'd used it. Children. She'd learned the names. She'd memorized 16 pages. She'd thought 3 moves ahead on a highway in the dark, while a man with an empty hand was deciding whether to keep it empty. Children. That's not something you're born with. That's something you earn by refusing to stop thinking, even when thinking is terrifying. Children. And then there's Silas. He had every reason to keep his door shut. He had built a life specifically around the principle of not being involved, and it had been working, more or less, for 6 years. Children. But when Nora sat in his boat shed and told him the truth, he didn't calculate his own risk first. He asked how far Raleigh was. Children. That's the thing about people with a genuine sense of right and wrong. They don't negotiate with it. They don't say I would help but. Children. They say how far, and then they start planning. Children. What I take from this is something I've had to relearn more than once. The people who do actual good in the world are rarely the ones with the most resources. They're the ones who are honest about what they see, who think clearly enough to act on it, and who have the endurance to keep going when the road floods and the truck gets sideswiped and the bluff might not land. Children. Nora carried those 16 pages for 11 months because Sandra Moat trusted her with them. Children. Silas drove 4 hours into something that wasn't his problem because his father had lost everything to the same family. Children. And because he was the kind of man who believed that history has a claim on the present. Those weren't accidents. Those were choices made by people who had decided somewhere along the way, children, that what they did with what they knew actually mattered. Children. I think it does. I think that's the whole thing, really.